So once everything's set up in Google Cloud, you're ready to start working on the One Tap implementation. Now, of course, it's up to you whether you want to start working on the front end or the back end first. Personally, I worked on them together so I could flip back and forth and make sure everything worked. This way, on the client side, you can go ahead and get the JWT token, and then you can maybe use Postman to test your token with your Ktor backend. But for this video, I'm just going to go ahead and start with Ktor. So I'm using a new branch in my existing Ktor API, and it's called Google One Tap. If you'd like to get started from a brand new project, go ahead and check out my previous videos, and you can follow along once you've created the project. So for my Ktor endpoints, we need to validate this Google JWT token. And for that, I've created two endpoints, users authenticate and get a user by ID. For the sign up, sign in endpoints, this route basically inserts or returns an authenticated user. So in the header, I'm including an M1 key, and this is something that Google One Tap allows you to do to make sure that it's actually your app that initiated the request. And then I send the authorization bearer along with the JWT token that I've gotten from Google. And then once everything's been authenticated and I've saved the user ID to my app, that's when I basically call to get the user by ID. And to authenticate that, I'm using an API key that's built in as a static constant in my app and authenticated on the back end. So to store all of my secrets in Ktor, I've created some environment variables in IntelliJ. To do this, you can click on Edit Configurations from IntelliJ. And once you've opened the window, click the little box for the details, and then you can add in whatever you like. For this, I've added my IP address and also the web client ID. And go ahead and save them. Okay, that's pretty much everything for the setup. So once you get everything in place, we're ready to start working on the Ktor API code. So for the Ktor API, let's start with the application config file. In the first block, I'm setting up my deployment settings, including the host IP address and the port. And here's what's really cool about environment variables. I can just use this environment IP address that I created from inside IntelliJ, and when I build the project, it's going to pull the IP address right in. And then for the next block, I set my application module. And finally, this block is actually a custom block that sets the API key that's authenticated from the Android app side. So this API key will actually be used to validate the routes where it's specified, and I'll get into that in a second. And then finally, we have the Google JWT block, and this is where we define everything Google JWT related, including the issuer, the audience, and I'm not using the realm right now, so we don't have to worry about that. And the issuer and the audience are going to come into play when we actually go to validate the JWT token. Next, let's take a look at the data layer. For my tables, I have a user table that includes the user ID, the email that we get from the Google JWT token, the name that we get from the Google JWT token, a user create date, and then the primary key. And for the database, since my user table already existed and I made changes to it, I was able to use this create missing tables and columns, which is a really handy tool. If I was starting out from scratch, I would not use this, but it was just a really quick and easy way to get things going and to get my table structure altered. The user model is pretty straightforward. It's pretty much identical to the SQLite table with the user ID, email, name. One thing I did want to show you is this payload to user mapper. So this is really cool. It takes the JWT payload and it maps it to the user model. So it gets the email claim and it gets the name claim from the payload and returns a user back. Now for the DAO, I map the user row to a user. And then there's two key functions, get user by email and get user by ID. So, and both of these query to my helper function here, which gets a user. So this get user function takes the user query and either searches by the email that we got from the JWT token, or from the user ID that's passed from the Android application. So how does this JWT validation work? Well, let's start with the security plugin first. So here I have two different authentication types. I can either authenticate routes based on an API key that I'm passing from my Android app, or I can have the JWT Google authentication. So what I've done here is created this module, and then within this module, I install my different authentication configurations. So let's take a look at the Configure Google JWT first. For my Google JWT configuration, I pass the application config from the top-level authentication plugin. Next, I use the application config to get the issuer and the audience values from my application config file. In this case, the issuer is accounts.google.com, and the audience is our web client ID that we created in Google Cloud. To verify the token signature, I load Google's public keys from their JWT OAuth URL. With that set up, now it's time to create the JWT authentication provider. I give this instance a unique name of Google in case I decide to implement my own JWT tokens later on. Next, I use Google's public keys that are stored in the JWT provider to verify the token signature. I also make sure that the token contains the Google issuer URL and my web client ID. With Validate, I can access my request header. I pass an M1's value from my Android app using Ktor HTTP client. If the XM1's header value is empty, then I return null and the validate function fails. Now that I know the N1's from the header is not null, I get the N1's claim from the token, and I make sure that it matches what was passed in with the header. So here's the check here, and if it fails, again, validate returns null. Finally, if validation is successful, I return the payload. For the challenge, I've created a custom Google exception. This exception is called in my Configure Status Exceptions module and responds with invalid Google credentials. And I'll show you what that looks like now. I use the Status Pages plugin to provide consistent error handling for all of my routes. If JWT validation fails and a Google exception is thrown, the API returns with an unauthorized status code, along with the invalid Google credentials error code in the response errors data class. Here's a list of my app error codes, which include the types of errors that routes can produce. In my Android app, I can easily show these errors in a snack bar. To authenticate the API key from the Android application, this module is very simple. It basically creates the API key plugin with its own name for the app. And basically, it takes the key from the header, and if the key matches the key from the application config file, then we're all good and the route is authenticated. To use the Google JWT validation, I call authenticate from the user route. I get my JWT principal, I get the expires at from the JWT token, and then I get my request, which I take the JWT payload and I map it to a user object. And with that user object, that will give me the email address and the username from the JWT token. So with that information, I call get or insert user. And let me show you that. That's up in my use cases. And this just very simply takes the user email and gets the user by email with the DAO. And if it comes back successful, then it just returns the user object. Otherwise, it goes ahead and inserts a new user. And that's pretty much it for this route, and it returns either an error or the successful user object from the JWT validation. And next, to get a user by ID, it calls authenticate again, but this time we're using the API key from the Android app. So as long as that's successful, we get the user ID, and then we get a user by the actual user ID. And again, if that's successful, we return the user object. Otherwise, we return a standard application error. That's pretty much it for the Ktor API. Next, I'll go over the Android application.